Hi everyone, my name is Bridget Cuso, and I'm going to take a few minutes to talk to you today about Voltaire. You can see that I've written here Voltaire, also known as Arouet, and your 18th century rebel. Well, that's because, as you'll soon find out, Voltaire was unlike any other philosopher I've learned about. He really set his own ways and paved his own paths and really followed the beat of his own drum. So to start off with, we're going to start off with a quick little video that gives us a little bit of background about who Voltaire was.
Welcome to Visual Knowledge. 3 reasons to love Voltaire. Voltaire was a philosopher and writer. He has expressed ideas on freedom of speech, free trade, church, civil liberty, tolerance, and much, much more. Voltaire did not believe
You're going to want to remember this free speech one because it's going to come into play later when we tie in Voltaire to education practices today.
in any single religion, and therefore considered himself a deist, which can also be referred to as rational religion. We can define rational religion in 3 phases. God has created the universe. He rejects supernatural aspects or miracles. God has given humans reason. To define deism even further, Voltaire often saw the differences in religion as trivial. He was particularly critical of the church and saw the clergy, which are the deacons, priests, and bishops, or to put simply, important former leaders of the church, as unnecessary and harmful. He detested the superstition aspect of religion.
We need to remember here when we're talking about religion that before the Enlightenment, religion was the be-all and end-all, and education was ruled by the Catholic Church. So a big step towards education in the Enlightened period was Voltaire's stance on religion, saying that he rejects the idea of one sort of religion that rules everybody.
And relied on reasoning. Reasoning is a central theme of rational religion. Another important distinction in rational religion is that God does not interfere, therefore taking a step back. To sum this up metaphorically, if we think of Earth as a plane, God has created it, but he is not driving this plane, nor is he involved in its navigation to where it's going.
I think this point was really interesting when you connect it to education. So it's kind of like the teacher in the classroom. So she's giving the airplane, she's giving the curriculum, but she can't drive the airplane. It's the students in the classroom who are driving the airplane. So just some interesting connections to make with Voltaire in the classroom there.
In defining the spirit of Voltaire, his biographer stated the following, quote, "I disagree with what you say, but I defend your right to say it," end of quote. Voltaire would say many things that would land him in trouble. For example, one of his poems led to the impact of his incarceration. When it came to religion, Voltaire was particularly critical, but he was still in favor of the toleration of religious belief. One would assume that even though Voltaire would use satire in his work to express his views on philosophical optimism, one would assume that he would still tolerate the alternative perspective. Indeed, Voltaire understood the impact of having free speech and the impact of restricting it. This is captured in the following quote, "Tolerance has never provoked a civil war. Intolerance has covered the earth in carnage," end of quote. Now, the 18th century is seen as the age of enlightenment. If this was
I want you to remember the concept of enlightenment because this is going to be really important later on in the presentation.
Movie, you had a cast of characters that played a significant part in education of human progression. Think of the characters, and we're only going to name a few, and please forgive the pronunciation. Edward Jenner, the father of humanology. To Leonard Euler, a mathematician who discovered calculus and geometry. To Isaac Newton, a physicist who discovered gravity. And of course, Voltaire, the prolific writer and advocate of freedom of thought and big opposer of the Catholic Church. And of course, there are much more. To summarize in a concise manner, reason, logic, and science triumphed over the concept of faith and institutionalized religion. This has painted the intellectual template for the world we live in today. And Voltaire was...
It's important to note, too, that before Enlightenment, the role of education was really based on raising priests and nurses and doctors, but there wasn't much more outside of that. It was so restricted, and Voltaire couldn't handle the restriction, and that's why he went against the Catholic Church and was one of the founders of the Enlightenment theory.
An integral part of this enlightenment that led to this template. This was an age of the freedom of thought. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Subscribe, like, and share with Facebook friends.
All right, so you get the idea. You have a bit of an idea about who Voltaire is. Here's a few things that you should also consider about Voltaire. He was imprisoned for nearly a year, and this happened when he was just a teenager. So Voltaire changed his name when he was young, and he just, like I said, really followed the beat of his own drum. So he would go against the government, and this actually landed him in jail. And he mocked the government while he was in jail, saying, it was great. He needed this time to think. And so he made his way through his imprisonment and came out and continued to still keep writing. He wrote this really interesting book called Candide, which if you have a bit of extra time, I would suggest looking into. It has some really great philosophies and stories behind it. So most of his famous works were banned, and that was because it went against everything that was in power then. It went against the government, it went against religion, it went against the way everybody thought. So Voltaire was really brave, and I think it's really cool that he believed in something so strongly and fundamentally that he went against what everybody else said. It's funny to note that he actually had a brief career as a spy for the French government. So that didn't last long because really Voltaire was just collecting information and was using it to his own advantage. And over here, he continued causing controversy even after his death. So because the Catholic system denounced him because he didn't agree in any one particular religion, they refused to let him be buried on Catholic grounds. So this brings me to Enlightenment, and that was one of Voltaire's biggest pieces of work, was the theory of Enlightenment, along with several other gentlemen. And pertaining to education was the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. So the ancients really believed that information, we call it kind of like a cannonball. I think that's on the next slide here. But they believed in a cannonball system where information could be packed tightly and somebody would come out in front of you and just throw it out to you and you would remember it. And that was completely against what Voltaire believed. He was with the moderns when it came to the Enlightenment, and that he believed that education has a fundamental role in society. So he wanted to get rid of what they called canonized knowledge, which was a regurgitation of knowledge. He didn't feel that people should sit in the classroom and transfer knowledge from one brain into the next brain, write it down on a piece of paper, and there's your A. So he agreed that you should use your own understanding of the material. And when you weren't capable of developing your own information and understanding of the material, he would coin that as being immature. He viewed maturity as the ability to take knowledge and build your own understanding of it. And one of his sayings that I absolutely love so much was that we must cultivate our own garden. And that actually comes from, if you remember on the last slide, I mentioned the book Candide. It comes from the book of Candide. And what Voltaire is really talking about here is sort of like a failure cycle, that when we're gaining knowledge in the classroom, we must cultivate our own garden. We can't grow somebody else's garden for them. We can't compare our garden to somebody else's. We must take what we have. We must take the understanding of the knowledge that we have and build on it. And we're going to fail, and that's okay. And every time we fail, we get a little bit closer to success. So the idea of cultivating your own garden through education was something that really stuck out to me as a really interesting principle. One of Voltaire's quotes, and he has so many great quotes, if you have a chance, I would highly recommend that you would research some of them. But one of his great quotes was, "Think for yourself and let others enjoy the privilege of doing so too." And to me, I really connected this to education because as educators, we have this curriculum in front of us that we have to deliver to the students, but it goes back to one of our assignments in this class is how are concepts formed? We all form concepts differently, and when you're standing in front of the classroom, you can't be canonizing this information to a student and expecting them to share the same concept that you do. Just the same way in this class, if somebody else was presenting on Voltaire, they might have a completely different perspective. They might not like him. They might think he was a rebel and went against society and rules, and but this is my concept of them. And so this quote to me as an educator was really important. Think for yourself. So as a teacher, yes, I'm standing up there, I'm lecturing about solar systems, and I think that pollution is a terrible thing, and little Johnny might not think it's quite as bad, and that's okay, because true education happens when you're not using my information I'm giving to you, but you're forming your own thoughts and concepts about it. So I just thought that was a great tie-in with education. But as I mentioned before, I highly recommend checking out just a quick Google search of Voltaire's quotes. He has so many of them. He was so outspoken. He was one of the best writers that the French has ever had. So very interesting information. And then the final page of my presentation is the 21st century learning. Are we enlightened yet? And I really struggled with this part of my presentation because I'm really not sure if we are enlightened yet. Doing some research, some people say yes, we are, because we're more forward thinking, but I'm not sure we're there yet. So in Voltaire's opinion, to be enlightened, we had to break away from past education theories, and we still use all those theories today. Now, while I agree that those theories are beneficial because they help us shape the way we deliver information, we can't rely on them to be our only concept of education. And that goes back to one of our other papers, that teaching is a craft. So we need to remember that it's constantly evolving. And yes, we can take these theories and build on them, but we need to remember that they're not the be-all and end-all. And there's always a quest for more knowledge. And it shouldn't be somebody else's knowledge. It should be our own knowledge that we form for ourselves. I also think that we need to question the way we deliver education. We still, I find in my own experiences, going back to this canonized term, these standardized tests and the testing we do, we're expecting the knowledge to transfer from my book to your brain and out on a piece of paper again. And is that really learning the material? Somebody can memorize those facts, but are they really going to be able to apply that information later in life? Not so sure. And finally, the last question that I'm going to leave for you to think on is, are we literate or are we educated? And there's a big difference. And I hear the term literate and educated used interchangeably, and I think that's really unfair. I think that literate is that ability that we talked about before to just transfer knowledge, from, I read a book, I can write a book report, that's the end of it. But to be educated is really to take that material that you've read and create something for yourself from it. And that links back to Voltaire's whole freedom of speech that we talked about at the beginning through the video. It's his right for us to explore the world through unseen eyes and to look at everything from our own perspective. So I leave you with that, with my last question. Are we literate or are we educated? Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today.